Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our Bronx Forum today on the path to ranked choice voting, the second virtual event in a 5-part series bringing together policymakers, leaders from government, advocacy professors, professionals, academia, and the media. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter at City and State. Before we jump into our event, I would like to thank our great sponsor, Spectrum, for helping us put on this event today. It's an exciting time. The upcoming election cycle is the first in the city to use ranked choice voting, which is already changing how candidates campaign for elective office in the city. We got a diverse group of experts here today to unpack it all, everything that has to do with how ranked choice voting actually works and what it means moving forward as the 2021 mayoral race heats up. But before we get to their insights, Roche, Director of Government Affairs at Charter Communications, has a few things to say to help us set the mood.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for having us, and welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. It is definitely an honor to be here and represent Charter Communications, also known as Spectrum, one of the sponsors of today's event. And I think it's just important to note that information is critical, and it's an essential part of a vibrant democracy and an informed public. And so we want to make sure that that's especially the approach that we have when we're talking about changing the very procedures that enable people to exercise their right to vote. Now, in 2021, as we here know, but as many New Yorkers may not know, a new form of voting went into effect in New York City called ranked choice voting, and also known as instant runoff voting. Now, the average New Yorker may not be as savvy as some of our guests joining us today, but that's why, this is such an important conversation, why we're so proud to be a part of it. And like anything else in New York City, from bagels to baseball teams, this new voting procedure is definitely going to have its proponents and its critics. And we just recognize that the issues around it are very complex. And there's a lot of valid questions. How is this going to affect the voting experience? How will this change, if at all, how votes are tabulated? What will this mean for voter engagement across the board? Many would argue that it's now more critical than ever that we empower people, not just to understand voting, but understand how that process works. And so for our part, we're certainly pleased to help bring this discussion to the forefront, and especially here in the Bronx. We're going to be having similar panel discussions in the coming weeks in other boroughs. And this is especially close to home for us. We live in the city. I live in the Bronx, and our workforce is here. And so this is as much a conversation about all of us gathered here today as it is about, everyday New Yorkers and the backbone of our community. So thanks for everyone again for your participation, for being here. And Zach, I'll turn it back to you. You can take us on our way.
Well, that's a pretty good setup for us right there. Obviously, the stakes are really big, democracy itself. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who has reported enough on ranked choice voting to become one of the few journalists out there that really know the ins and outs of this new voting system and what it means for the 2021 Democratic primary for mayor. My colleague at City and State, Rebecca Lewis.
Hi, I'm glad that everyone is able to join us today for this panel. I'm hoping that it will be a good panel, informative, and that as many questions as people have will get answered. We're starting off today with 2 brief interviews with some mayoral candidates, starting with Ray McGuire, who is a Wall Street executive who is running for mayor. Thank you for joining us here, Ray.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
So I wanted to just start by asking, you have been quoted expressing some reservations, some concerns about ranked choice voting in terms of education and ensuring that there is no disenfranchisement happening. How are you feeling about it now? It's been a couple months, we're a couple months into 2021. We've had our first test of it. How do you feel about it right now?
So listen, thanks for having me. The intent is, I think, an important intent here. That's to encourage the voter participation and positive campaigning. And I think it's a good thing, which is why our voters voted for it and approved it. What I expressed was making certain that we were appropriate in how we educated and informed the voters. If the intent is to make sure that you got more voter participation and that the candidates were more constructive in their engagement, I think we're satisfying one of that with the constructive engagement of the candidates up to this point. But I'm not convinced yet that we have gone through and informed and educated the voting population the way that is necessary in order for the intent to be fulfilled, in order for us to actually get done what we expect to get done.
Now, what do you want to see then between now and June, and between now and the various upcoming special elections, to make sure that the education is done, that there aren't any communities left out, and that no one is going to their polling locations, in the dark?
So listen, I think forums like this are really important. Our campaign has gone through several series of educating and informing the voting population. What we need is to make certain that we get to the voting population through every mechanism possible. We need to consider those who are not digital. My mother is 94 years old. My mother-in-law is 95 years old. As they go to the polls and vote, I want to make certain that they understand that for which they're voting. We also need to make certain that we do it in multiple languages. So we need to have multilingual. We need to make certain that when people actually view the ballot, that the fonts and things like that are large enough for them to do that. So there's a whole process that we need to undertake to make certain that our voters, the most informed and the least informed, actually know the process by which they're voting. And that's where I want to make certain that we improve on where we are. I'm not convinced that we are where we need to be in educating the entirety of the population and getting the information into the population in a way that is digestible. We got to take the information to the people. We can't assume that they can get it. We need to be active in disseminating that information across all 5 boroughs and make certain that all demographics, regardless of age or language, understand what's going on.
One of the aspects of ranked choice voting is, an expectation that campaigning will change slightly, or maybe not so slightly, compared to a plurality system. How do you expect it will impact your campaigning before June?
I don't think my campaigning is going to change at all. I've always tried to have a constructive approach to competition. That's not going to change it because of ranked choice voting. You have to treat people the way that you'd like to be treated. I understand that people say this is the world of politics. I'm not a politician. I didn't get termed out. I'm not looking for a promotion. And so I come at this, and I've never served in any administration. So hopefully people will look at me, and the electorate will look at me as with the sole focus of what's in the best interest of New Yorkers. And I would expect that we would campaign that way. At least that's the way I have and will continue to campaign.
And one last question for you. Do you have any thoughts about who your number 2 would be in this race?
I continue to review that. A number 2 in a city that I love so deeply means that, it's like being a caregiver. And you want to make certain that if you transition to something else, that the care that you're giving is given the same way. And today the city we're in a crisis, so we need that person who can actually lead and manage the city forward. And so I'm going through making certain that the agendas of all the people who are in this race is the right agenda, that they have the experience to go and lead the city, manage the city, and that they have enough experience to lead, because that's what's going to require, and to bring the city together. Any divisive agenda is not going to move forward. So I'm assessing the candidates to see who I think is most qualified other than myself to do that. And the jury's still out.
Certainly that is going to be an important process, both for you as a candidate and for the rest of the electorate. So I wish you the best of luck. And thank you so much for joining us in this panel and taking some time to chat about ranked choice voting today.
Thank you. Very important. And I'm delighted that you all are having this panel. It's so important. So thank you for having me.
Next up, we would like to we would like to welcome City Council Member Carlos Menchaca, who is also running for mayor. Welcome, Council Member. How are you today?
Hi, Rebecca. Buenas tardes.
I want to start by asking, you obviously are still a member of the council, and you had an opportunity to vote on legislation to set firm guidelines and goalposts for the city to meet for education. How do you feel now that that's passed? Do you think that, the city is going to be in a better place? Do you think that the city is going to meet those goalposts for education?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It was an important moment in the council as we heard concerned citizens and even some concerned council members about, including myself, about how we were going to get the message out to so many New Yorkers in this diverse city. There are millions of people registered to vote. And when we saw a real uptick in the last election in 2020, we wanted to ensure that everybody had what they needed. And that means that there needs to be resources. And so we're asking the city to do that. But we're going to want to go beyond those bills that are asking for outreach. I want to ask all the candidates. There are hundreds of people running right now that can utilize funds, and many of those are going to be publicly issued funds with matching to educate our New Yorkers. This is going to be an opportunity to use creativity to bring more people into the voting process in multiple languages. And this is a really beautiful moment for the city of New York.
That's actually a great segue into the next question I want to ask you, which is how do you plan to integrate ranked choice voter education into your own campaign?
Well, I've learned a lot. This is my third campaign. My first two were successful, and part of that success was really ensuring that I hit every corner of the district when I was council member candidate or council candidate. And as mayor, I'm going to be doing the same thing. Multilingual approaches is not just for the city to do, it's just for candidates. Candidates need to engage everyone where they are. And that's why cultural and linguistic sensitivity is going to be important. That's what's going to be central to my campaign. So language, but also encouraging community members to organize in their neighborhoods. COVID has changed everything. People are in their neighborhoods talking in different ways, using different types of technology. And so that's what we're going to utilize for this campaign. Not just the message about why I need to be the next mayor and really work for our neighborhoods, but that our neighborhoods can talk about the importance of these races: council, controller, public advocate, and mayor.
What do you want to see from some of your fellow candidates? Are you planning to work with any of your fellow candidates to get the word out about ranked choice voting, or with other, council candidates? There are certainly no shortage of them this cycle.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are trying to build coalitions, and that's the beauty of ranked choice voting. This plurality, it's a word that just means more working together to ensure that more people can know who you are and add you to one of the ranked choice voting spaces. People will be voting for their first choice, but they have other options. And so candidates, whether they're mayoral candidates or council candidates, are going to be really important to work together and share resources to get the messages out. And I think you're already starting to see that, but there are many days before the primary. And so we'll see how that evolves.
From the city level, what do you want to see? What do you want to see the BOE and the CFB, and to whatever extent the mayor's office might get involved as well? What do you want to see from the city, not just from other candidates?
I want to see what we saw during census. I co-chaired the census task force in the city council, and we brought $40 million of resources. This is before COVID hit. And what happened when COVID hit was we had the resources to engage. We learned so much about engaging communities that are not connected to government right now. That's what I want to see the city do. Utilize the resources that we've already built with organizations on the ground, nonprofits that can engage people that trust them. And that's what I'm hoping the city does. I'll be working as a city council member to ensure that oversight happens. But as a mayoral candidate, I want to ensure that we're seeing what we need to see and that we are exemplifying that kind of creativity and New York attitude to work together, to do everything we can to ensure that this is a successful democratic process in June.
And final question, same final question. Have you given any thought about who your number two would be in this race?
I have, and it just changes. We're having a lot of conversations on the back end, and I want to work with someone that, or I want to vote for someone that I can work with, and more information happens to come out. And so, I was really impressed with Art Chang last night. We had a big Staten Island forum, and I just keep, being impressed by some of the ideas that he's bringing out.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to chat a little bit about
Thank you.
ranked choice voting and in the mayoral race. We are going to move on now to our main event, our panel discussion with a series of experts. Thank you again, council member. So I would like to introduce our panel that we have with us today. We have State Senator Jamal Bailey. We have Council Member Vanessa Gibson, Sean Duger, the Rank the Vote NYC Education Campaign Director, and Deborah Lee Santos, who is Editor-in-Chief of the Manhattan Times Press and the Bronx Free Press. So thank you all for joining us today as we talk about this incredibly important topic of ranked choice voting, which will decide so many important elections this year, and additionally 2 upcoming special elections right here in the Bronx. So I want to just start by, throwing it out there, broadly speaking, the question of how will ranked choice voting work in New York City? For anyone who wants to answer that.
Well, I guess I'll start. So good afternoon, everybody in City and State and Spectrum. Thank you for the invite. I have to, in my other hat, I do represent Westchester County, so I will be going to the Westchester Budget Forum. So if you see me drop off, it's not because I don't love you, it's because I have other counties to deal with. But in this county, this is going to be entirely brand new. And as Mr. Menchaca and Mr. McGuire mentioned before, it's a new way of voting. And so we have to do everything that we can in order to ensure that people have the proper education. Now, we had record turnout in this past presidential election, which is great. We want to be able to keep that same energy, so to speak. But we want people not to be disenfranchised because they're not familiar with this type of voting, right? So to that end, on January 26th, the Democratic County Organization here in the Bronx, we held a ranked choice voting forum with Rank the Vote, and I feel like it helped to ameliorate some of the concerns that people had that had never heard of the concept before. But there has to be a consistent and ongoing investment in not just this election, because quite frankly, even in these special elections happening in Queens coming up and also the ones in the Bronx on March 23rd, it's going to take a lot more than just these special elections. And even in June for people to really get the hang of a brand new way to vote. So I guess I'll start with that.
Thank you so much. And I'll add, and thank you, City and State and Spectrum. And it's good to see all of you, my colleague and Rank the Vote and Deborah Lee. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I agree, everything echoed by Chairman Senator Bailey. And I also think that for many of our communities that we represent, predominantly communities of color, we have to recognize and make sure that there are no efforts to disenfranchise voters or suppress the right for people to vote. And the state legislature, we have passed a number of election reforms, early day voting, and really made it easier for voters to be able to vote in their own communities with accessible and convenient sites. And I think when you look at Rank the Vote and the fact that over 70% of voters in New York City overwhelmingly voted for this in November of 2019, it is a recognition that we are changing the way in which we vote. There are other cities and municipalities in the country that have implemented such a measure. And so we've had a lot of meetings and ongoing dialogue with other boards of elections to see how they implemented such measures in their own cities. And so I think for New York City being the largest, everything we do, we create an agenda and we set a real platform. But I really want to make sure that there is a robust education and outreach campaign, because many of our voters tend to be older voters, traditional voters, and they remember, the ballots, they remember the lever machines, and now we have the paper machines. And so we're constantly changing the way we vote. You can vote early now. And so I just want to make sure that, we look at opportunities of being creative on the ground, of grassroots levels. And because of the pandemic, we're not able to meet in person in large scales. So a lot of our outreach has been through remotes, through informationals and webinars. We held one earlier this week with the Campaign Finance Board, and we had a large participation. But what we've said to our constituents is we need you to share this information. Tell your neighbor, tell your mother, your father, share this information so that all of you understand what Rank the Vote does mean and ranked choice voting.
I'll jump in just really quickly. Again, thank you all for hosting this panel. And thank you to the electeds who are here talking about education. I've been running ranked choice voting, candidate campaigns, doing ranked choice advocacy, and just doing education for the past decade in the Bay Area of California. It's really important that we have all hands on deck for education. We say education is a three-legged stool. And so you need to have government doing education, which I think the CFB is doing a great job in reaching out to community boards and into NYCHA and other organizations You have to have organizations, nonprofits like Rank the Vote NYC. You know, just in the Bronx alone, we're working with the NAACP and with Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition and with Dominicanos to ensure that folks on the ground are getting the resources and education they need. But you also need candidates. Candidates have to do education. And so, you know, we've trained over 150 candidate campaigns. Last I heard there are about 450, so we still have a ways to go, but ensuring that everybody is using the same messaging and reaching voters where they are is critical.
Very quickly, I would just like to remind everyone who has tuned in, if you have any questions, to please submit them through the Q&A function, and to use the chat for any discussion you may have amongst yourselves. The Q&A function is the best way to get your questions to myself for to integrate into the conversation. So thank you. And Deborah Lee, so I didn't mean to cut off if you were about to say anything. So
Sure.
Please jump in.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you all for being part of this important conversation, particularly as it regards the Bronx. To piggyback on some of the comments that our colleagues and fellow panelists have shared, it's important to note that ranked choice voting isn't going to be nothing short of a radical change in electoral politics here in the city of New York. I mean, simply by adopting municipal ranked choice voting here, we have virtually tripled the number of U.S. residents that are using it throughout the country. Maine, which is the only state that has all of its races decided by by ranked choice voting, has upwards of about 1.7 million residents. We have 8 in the city of New York, 8 million residents. So that radically changes what this experiment is going to look like, both in the city, but certainly across the country. And I think it's important too to note that the last race that was held, which was the first test of ranked choice voting, being held in Queens, for all the talk for all the talk about candidates of color rising sort of to the top of people's attention span, that this diversifies the field and allows for perhaps a more level space in which to compete. What you found was that a former city council member was a person who emerged triumphant with 60% of the vote. And the second candidate, which was a candidate of color, Mumita Ahmad, in fact, although the field itself was filled with candidates of color and a far more diverse representation than you might typically get in that kind of race, in fact, came in second with 16% of all votes. And that speaks, I think, to a number of things, not the least of which is the role of independent expenditures. But there's certainly perhaps a prologue to what you might see elsewhere. And finally, just on that point, I do think it's important for us in this conversation and going forward in the very short amount of time that's allotted between now and the March 23rd special election races that we're seeing in the Bronx for the 11th and the 15th Councilmanic District, to talk about resource allocation. This is really an economic conversation, and it's not just about what the city is investing or what the Board of Elections will end up doing or how we're going to sort of engage in outreach. It fundamentally is what it is that you're asking Bronx residents to allocate their attention upon. And if you're looking at the landscape of what the Bronx looks like right now, when they're vying for a spot at Yankee Stadium for a vaccine, perhaps, or elsewhere, when you're asking them to switch schedules because middle school is shortly going to be in order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you're looking at this from the prism of what this county has undergone in the last year, you really need to start asking different questions about what you're asking Bronx residents to, again, append their resources to.
And certainly there's a lot to follow up with that, certainly. But before we get into some of that, I just want to maybe give Sean an opportunity as our ranked choice voting expert, a brief rundown of, what exactly the basics, the absolute basics of what people need to know and what they should expect to see on their ballots when they go to vote. Sure.
So first, I would encourage you all to visit our website, rankthevotenyc.org. We have a mock ballot there that you can play around with as well as there's a link to a mock election that was dropped in the chat. So number one is you can rank as many people as you like, from 1 to 5, including a write-in candidate. You don't have to rank 5. You can rank 3. You can rank 4. It's totally up to you. Second is that you're having a second or third choice does not hurt your number one candidate. Remember, your second or third choice only kicks in if your number one, if your favorite has already lost the race and is no longer a viable candidate. And then third is, there's always a lot of talk about folks having to learn about all the candidates. One of the benefits of ranked choice voting is that it forces the candidates to reach out to every single voter, not just a small subset that they would normally utilize to win. So with that, did you want me to go through the tabulation process as well right now?
Perhaps very briefly. I personally have seen some questions about this, and I know that there has been a little bit of dueling information out there about how the tabulation will work. So I definitely think that a brief rundown might be beneficial.
Awesome. So I am going to share my screen really quickly. This again is the poll, the mock election that we are running right now, and the link is in the chat. But here you can see the tabulation process for favorite fruits. You'll see that tortilla chips and peanut butter and jelly are in last place with 9 votes. You see fruit in first place with 42 and chips with 39. In this case, there are 221 votes that have been cast already, meaning a candidate, in order to win, has to receive 50% plus 1 vote of the total votes cast. So that total will be 111. So we'll scroll down. We'll see through the tabulation process, whoever the lowest vote getters are eliminated. So in this case, PB&J and tortilla chips. And so their second choice are the voters who voted for peanut butter and jelly and tortilla chips. Their second choices now kick in and were given to nuts, hummus and veggies, and cookies. And so we continue that process of eliminating whoever is the lowest vote getter, or if there are vote getters that are in the candidates that have a similar number of votes, they're eliminated together in a batch. So now we see pretzels was eliminated, and their votes went to fruit and potato chips. And we continue this process until a candidate receives 50% plus 1 of the vote, but we also continue that process until the final 2 candidates. And so what you'll see in continuing the rounds and final 2 candidates is that usually, instead of a candidate winning with just 51 or 50% plus 1 of the vote, they might have won with 60%, which gives them a larger mandate to ensure that they're representing the entire district, the entire city in their government.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that was a very good, very concise way of showing how ranked choice voting will work, from when you cast your ballot to when the counting ends. Again, that is until there are 2 candidates left. But as soon as someone hits 50%, they're the winner regardless. It's just by how much they win by.
Exactly.
Now that we have sort of the basics, that is what everyone's talking about with education. It's that. It's pretty much what we just saw. What are the obstacles that exist right now? Whether it's time, whether it is attention span, whether it is just the fact that people have a million things that they need to worry about right now. How do we make sure that this information gets out to as many people as possible, and not just the people who have access to computers and can join webinars like this, but older folks who are perhaps not computer literate, folks who don't have the same amount of time, folks in public housing who may not just have the digital access. How do we reach them?
Well, let me just say one, I do apologize. I will be leaving after this brief response to head to the other budget forum, but the Bronx Democratic County Organization, we will be looking to hold more informational sessions on ranked choice voting as we get closer to not just June, but March as well. But to your point, Rebecca, I think it's an incredibly correct point. We have the majority of the electorate, or still the majority of the electorate is an older electorate who may not necessarily be as tech savvy. And maybe they don't have access to these webinars. What about the essential workers who are working and making New York City move right now and taking care of our family members and people who are affected by COVID right now? They don't have the time to watch these wonderful webinars. So we have to find a way to get them the information. So the Campaign Finance Bureau is tasked with that information, and we could all do a better job of getting the information out. Elected officials and organizations as well. We have to do a better job of being able to tell our neighbor. But you're right, maybe it was the convergence of everything that was happening at the national level. These federal elections consumed a lot of our time. We were really concerned about what happened last November, and we just got past November. Now you're telling me there's a brand new way to vote. That's a difficult pill for some folks to swallow, but we're going to have to make sure that they understand how to vote, because the future of our municipality depends on it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly. And Rebecca, it's all of the above. It is recognizing, as Deborah Lee said, for so many of us in the Bronx that have been dealing with COVID-19, the most important priority right now is surviving, is protecting yourself and your family, whether it's COVID testing, the vaccination, if you're eligible, the basic necessities of a roof over your head, food on the table, navigating remote learning for children. I mean, that's what we are all focusing on right now. And so now that we are asking voters to vote in a different way, March 23rd, June 22nd, we have to make sure that we are, as I mentioned, we have to reach residents where they are. So beyond the informationals, the webinars are remotely, we have to start talking to folks at, the churches, the community centers, because we know that people are gathering, right? They're going to supermarkets, they're going to stores, they're shopping, the commercial corridors. We should involve small businesses, the bids, the merchants associations, some of our commercial partners, and some of our CBOs that are doing work remotely, but also doing work in person as well. What we've been doing the last several weeks with the vaccination here at Yankee Stadium and other sites, we have had to start doing door knocking within, our district, because a lot of our seniors don't have internet access to sign up for the vaccine. They can't do appointments. They don't know how to navigate. Many of them are bilingual. They don't speak English as a native language. So we've had to do a lot of that grassroots work. So what I believe as a way to get to these same voters is reach them where they are, but we're already working with them in some way. If it's COVID testing or vaccine, we should be sharing with them. By the way, ranked choice voting is coming up. Have you heard of it? And give them material in the language that they prefer. Language access and diversity is super important, and sharing information, because at the end of the day, I think it's important to make sure people understand that this is only applicable in primary elections, not the general, only municipal elections, not state elections and federal. So there are all these nuances that sometimes people don't understand. So my thing is, be creative. Let's identify some innovative approaches. Let's have partnerships. Rank the Vote should be working with CBOs, faith-based clergy, all of these different stakeholders that are already in our neighborhoods that have an audience of members, and we can gravitate towards that so we can reach the largest audience so people can be more prepared for March and June.
So I'll just add, what we've been doing is Rank the Vote NYC. In districts where there's special elections, we've been doing mail directly to prime voters. In just the first 2 districts alone, we've reached nearly 40,000 households. We have partnerships with entities like the Queens Public Library, where they're including our large print materials and all of their books by mail. So it's included in the deliveries. United Neighborhood Houses, they're doing education and providing materials at all of their locations. Again, we have partnerships with organizations like the NAACP and a number of other entities that are still on the ground doing the work. We have folks who have been out at all of the early voting locations to hand out literature to folks as they are going into early vote. Just as a last attempt, if we didn't get you via digital or one of these trainings, if we didn't do through, you know, the NAACP handing out 4,000 pieces of literature at NYCHA properties. If we didn't get you in any of those ways, we're getting you before you go in the polling place to ensure that you know about ranked choice voting. But the other part is, you know, any of us who have worked on campaigns or have run for office know voters don't start paying attention to elections 5 months out from an election. So I think, you know, we really are focused on the areas where there are specials, but also building that base and building out the campaigns in places in the rest of the city. You know, we translate all of our materials as Rank the Vote NYC into 13 different languages, and those are all available on our website for folks to print. We do have large font documents so that folks are able, folks who may be visually impaired are able to see. We have voiceovers, and we're launching a video in 2 weeks, an explainer video, again in 13 different languages, so that we're reaching everyone.
Can I just jump in and add that many of the suggestions and the creative outreach mechanisms that are being discussed here by everyone, in fact, have worked, right? We've used them. When I say we, I mean as a city, as a state, and as a community, when we need to leverage resources, when it comes to the census, when it comes to any other major changes, you know, for heaven's sakes, you know, when we want to announce, you know, that there's a small, minor change to, you know, traffic patterns or the rest, or bike lanes, you know, in a particular community, you're almost bombarded with the information to the extent that you're almost, you know, nauseated. And so we know what works, right? We know how to get people to respond, and we know, in fact, that people are in need of this information as much as they are in need of DOE updates and, again, vaccination updates. We know what platforms and levers exist. The question is, are we willing to put capital behind those efforts? And to the extent, when we were listening earlier to the two mayoral candidates who joined us, Ray McGuire and Carlos Menchaca, you know, you have to imagine that because they are afforded by you know, the fiat that is the media universe in New York City, sort of the larger platforms, more so than perhaps city council candidates outside of their districts, you would hope that they, because they are the standard bearers for this new system, that they would also be certain that while they're campaigning and participating in their own unique and creative ways, that they're sort of also carrying the responsibility forward and ensuring that people understand that when they're engaging with them and they're out there saying vote for me, that they're also saying there's going to be this new system that when you look at the ballot and choose to vote for me, you should also consider figure out how you work that into your messaging and your campaigning, but that there has to be sort of attendant in your pitch this conversation about choice voting, because if you continue to work in a very narrow space and talk only about yourself and about your platform and policy ideas, you then disincentivize the very system that you're going to be running on. Because if you're fixated on that particular message of yourself, you will in fact then, probably win over a number of people, and that's wonderful. But when they get to that moment of decision, they'll likely be surprised that they had more than one choice. And if they are continue with that particular path, you're not going to gain from that decision that they made. So I think it's important also when we talk about, well, what can we do? And, what, again, that royal we, that we attend to that conversation with a sense that the candidates are already sort of reimagining and reconfiguring the landscape, and that they must also bear some responsibility for tying in this part of that as well.
Thank you. That is absolutely true and absolutely necessary. I very quickly, I realized a little bit of confusion in the chat and the questions. As a point of clarity, ranked choice voting will only be used in special elections and primary elections for municipal elections. So that's mayor, city council, comptroller, public advocate, and I'm missing borough presidents, my bad, and borough presidents. It will not be used for the upcoming district attorney races. Those are technically state-run. They're not municipal. And it will not be used in November for the general elections. So municipal special and primary elections, not the district attorney races, and not in November. So if there was any confusion, I apologize. I realize I should have made that front and center very clear from the beginning. And so, yeah, certainly, everyone, please continue putting in your questions. To the point of this idea that there is going to be so many people right now are focused on getting the vaccines, focused on getting tested and keeping themselves safe. Is there an opportunity to couple, public health information, vaccination sites with this kind of civic education and engagement? If someone goes and gets their vaccine at a New York City site, that they are being handed information about ranked choice voting. Is this something that we should be doing? And is it something that is happening at all right now to anyone's knowledge?
Yes, Rebecca, that's exactly what we should be doing. But the challenge? No one talks to each other. So you have a lot of vaccination sites that are operated with the city and state, the mayor and governor, right? I have a site at Yankee Stadium, that's Somos Healthcare, National Guard. Then you have Bronx Rising that has sites, Morris Heights Health Center. We're at senior buildings, we're at community centers, but no one's talking to each other. So it would be great if we could have a real effort led by, if it's the mayor, if it's CFB, Rank the Vote, New York City Campaign Finance Board, Board of Elections, and we do a press conference and we announce this collaboration, right, to educate and do outreach on ranked choice voting 2021 in preparation for March 23rd and June 22nd. And we organize around the existing vaccination sites that we have, but also as we expand. This is great. This will be a game changer. And we can have English, Spanish, multiple language. We can have material and brochures. We can have volunteers, right? Because we also want to make sure that we're not, creating more crowds, but we are catering to the clients that are going to these sites who are older, who could be first responders and essential workers, taxi drivers, restaurant workers. All of them are New York City residents and voters, right? Potentially. So I think it would be a great idea. But the problem is that we have to have someone organize it and put it together so that everyone could be having the same conversation at the same time with the same goal in mind, which is education and outreach on ranked choice voting.
I'll jump in really quickly, and we have to give credit where credit is due. The council just a couple of weeks ago passed a bill that mandated all city departments to do ranked choice voting education. That was passed almost unanimously by the council. I think there was only one council member who didn't vote for it. But it was not Councilmember Gibson. It was not. So, I think now there is a mandate that the city and all departments have to do education. We just have to force them and have maybe some awesome council members further encourage them to all work together. We have the materials, anything they need, we have it. Same with CFB. CFB has been great in developing materials and having it in multiple languages. Some of the languages we're translating to are different than the languages they're translating into, and that's on purpose so that we're reaching as far and wide as we can.
I think that just to reiterate, I think that again, the mechanisms are there, the ability to marshal around a singular message and to ensure that everyone is reached has been demonstrated with success on a number of initiatives, as recently again as the census. And I want to point out that we need also to manage what is a level of apprehension about change at a time when so much upheaval is afoot. It's not an easy thing to have. We keep talking about how simple this process is, and fundamentally it is. It's been implemented elsewhere, and we must not negate the intelligence and wisdom of voters. We keep saying, well, 74% of voters opted for this, and all of a sudden we turn around and say, well, this is going to be really confusing for them. Well, it can't be both. They opted into a system that they want, right, and that they're looking forward to. And you can argue that they didn't know what they were necessarily getting into and all the rest, but we're here. And so we need, as a mandate, to accept the responsibility for the education that then has to ensue. And that does require, as everyone here has pointed out, all the efforts that have been mentioned and then some. But, to Councilmember Gibson's point, there's no reason. I mean, the vaccine conversation, the testing conversation, and all the city versus state dialogue aside, there's no reason that the very level of energy demonstrated by the mayor's office around any number of initiatives around which, again, people are cohering, cannot be demonstrated here. There's no lack of incentive, and there's no gain there's no lack of gain, rather, from the mayor's office and all of its full force getting behind this initiative and simply the education process in the same way that it did around the census. I mean, there was a director of the census outreach that was named. And again, I understand that resources are limited, but the idea is that kind of energy can be leveraged. And finally, just this, the Bronx in this last general election was one of the only county, it was the only county, I think, in New York City to see a loss in terms of electoral participation, where you saw a pickup elsewhere in the city. We should not ignore that. That came at a time when there was rabid attention being paid to the process of elections, of voting, and people were lining up around the block, and et cetera, et cetera. Yet in the Bronx, in the very some of the very same neighborhoods that are going to be voting within a month's time, you saw a drop in participation. That is something also that needs to be looked at and addressed, because we're talking about that very same constituent population being tapped to come out essentially in the next, again, the next month for these races. You have to ask yourself why they didn't turn out when the stakes were arguably so much higher a few months ago.
And, that has been, one of the things that proponents have pointed to, that they say that ranked choice voting, in fact, helps to increase voter turnout. But, that is a question about how much of an impact that'll have. But the first time around, what can we learn from the first special election where ranked choice voting was used, in terms of how to make sure that there is positive interactions, make sure that people know not just that there is a special election happening that they should turn out for, but that there is this new way of voting. Obviously we did not get to see ranked choice voting in its entirety with the different rounds of counting, but it was utilized nonetheless. We still had people who went in and ranked multiple candidates, even if we don't get to see multiple rounds of counting. So in terms of how the outreach looked there, what can we learn about how best to reach these communities that have seen voter turnout go down in ways that it hasn't in other parts of the city?
So I'll say this, in CD 24, we faced some obstacles, not the least of which was Mother Nature. And so the fact that voter turnout, although it was low, was much higher than any of us expected in that district, given the snowstorm and pandemic. There was actually, I think, a reporter for Politico who lives in the district, who took a picture of all of the communications that she had received just as a voter in that district, pieces of mail from candidates themselves, not just, the $100 per early vote that an independent expenditure spent. But she said that in that one special election, she received more communications from candidates and education on how to vote than she had for any citywide election since she had lived in New York City. And I think that's powerful, and it speaks to how ranked choice voting works, because it forces candidates to talk to everyone. It also forces organizations like ours to reach out to everyone. And so I think, we often say the voters in these 4 special election districts are going to be some of the best educated voters, because They're getting phone calls, they're getting text messages, they're getting emails, they're getting mail, they're getting literature dropped off at their door, they're seeing literature in their community centers. And I'm looking forward to that continuing to happen into the June election as well.
Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Well, just briefly, I think also, I know Sean touched on this, and I think it's worth expanding on. These shortened election cycles really cause for there to be a narrowing of the discussion and the space in which the campaigns must operate, right there, never mind the COVID restrictions. So independent expenditures, when they do come into play, are perhaps, going to have an outsized impact. And while, it's still a freshly minted election that we just saw in CD24, it's not, it should not escape our notice that pouring over $200,000 combined of common sense, NY money into that race was remarkably, one might argue, effective in how the outcomes played out. Certainly some of the candidates that did not win would say so. But it is important, as always, to follow the money. Look to see where independent expenditures that have always been part of that conversation when it comes to what's good, what's bad. Let's look at the pro, let's look at the con. But certainly when you're looking at these really, really narrow election cycles, when you're looking at a shortened space and time, and again, particularly because of COVID, they are likely to resonate in a way that is important.
I'm curious to the extent that each of you have been reached out to by people looking for answers, looking for some clarity, for information, whether that is, simply individuals sending an email or, through participation like panels and discussions like this. What is one of the most common concerns, questions, confusions that has come up?
I'll kick it off. We're doing on average about 6 to 7 trainings a day as Rank the Vote NYC. And often, I would say the most asked question is, does it hurt my first choice if I have another choice, if I rank? And again, no, it doesn't. It's a pretty easy one to answer. It doesn't hurt your first choice. It just extends the life of your ballot. Under the previous format of voting in New York, a city council candidate could win with 20% of the vote. That means the voice of 80% of voters was not heard in that final process. And so ranked choice voting not only helps the voter to ensure that their voice is heard further through the process, but also an elected official, whoever wins that election, now has a mandate. They have at least 50% plus one of the voting population with them, if not usually a higher amount. So they're able to go into the council chambers and say, hey, I have 60% of my district with me, not 20%. And so it just builds those bridges.
I think one of the most common questions I've received, and I've been out during the pandemic doing a lot of, PPE distribution and food distributions, and so much time has passed. So the first thing people will say is, well, when did we vote on ranked choice voting? And then when I tell them November 2019, they're like, well, Ms. Gibson, I barely remember what I did yesterday, let alone back in 2019. And I've seen the numbers, so I know an overwhelming amount of Bronx voters did vote for ranked choice voting, but so much has happened in over that year that I think it got lost on a lot of people. So for us, it's just about refreshing their memory, reminding them of how we got to where we are today. And then third, explaining to them what RCV is and how that impacts them. And then usually it will be coupled with material information, because a lot of residents, I never want to lose sight where some people assume in communities of color that people are not able to adapt to change, right? That's usually the assumption a lot of times. And I won't say that about my own residents and constituents, but I will say if given the time and the opportunity and we plan and do this strategically, people will adjust. And I think for every one of us, it's always got to be that first election, right? That we start with. And then once we continue on in other primaries, people will get more accustomed to it. What I worry a little bit about is that, again, it's not in general elections. It's not in the state and federal elections that are coming up next year. And so, I don't want people to forget about it because it's not consistent like early voting is, in which we do in every election. So that's the part for me that we just have to get over, where people understand that this is a certain election, a special primary election for local, municipal races, and not some of the other races that we typically are accustomed to seeing every few years.
Going back to the idea of what the average voter needs to know, there's also the matter of making sure that poll workers are educated as well. What kind of behavior do we want to see at the actual polls? I know that for however little time there is to educate the voters, there is equally little time to educate the poll workers who voters might have questions for. What kind of support do we want to see at the actual poll sites? Does that mean having equipping poll workers with more information, having sites set up more than 100 feet away from the poll sites with community groups, informing people before they go in? What kind of education should we be expecting for the actual poll workers who are going to be interacting with these voters who very well might not have had too much time or too many interactions with the new system before they go to vote?
So our sister organization, Common Cause, has been working with the BOE actually on their poll worker education and their poll worker script. So, we're making sure that they have the best information from across the country. And we've also connected them with consultants from the Ranked Choice Voting Education and Resource Center and other places, the Center for Civic Design, to ensure that every material that they have has the best explainer possible, so that everyone is educated. And then lastly, Common Cause has a very strong, oh my goodness, the word just popped out of my head. It's been a long day. Election protection program that works with a lot of different organizations. And so during the specials, we've been working with the Public Advocate's Office, which has a number set up that folks can call if they have questions or problems at the polling place during special election voting days, early voting, and election days. But in addition to that, we'll have folks outside of the polling places in June that will be election protection monitors, handing out information and able to help if there are any issues.
Can I just piggyback on that? I mean, I think when you talk about poll workers, it's sort of touching that third rail when it comes to the BOE, which is, traditionally been a space that has not necessarily been the most effective and the most efficient agency by the measures of innumerable sources. And what that does trickle down to is a level of frustration, both by and for poll workers who end up being frontline workers on the day of and end up having to absorb a great level of energy with any level of frustration that voters experience. They're sort of the vanguard there. And so I think that's a really good point about, what are we doing now to fortify, educate, and sustain their work and to ensure that They're not simply going to be perhaps your last moment of information and resource sharing before you make your decisions, but that they're also feeling equally empowered by the information that they have, that they can turn around and really be the kind of fully resourced and realized workers in that particular moment. And that's a difficult thing to manage on any day in this New York City election, let alone on one that's going to be beset by the many challenges we're going to see in this year. I go back and I think that, again, we should look to put some of this onus in this conversation on the candidates themselves, both on the mayoral level, but on the municipal level as well. They're already doing the work. They're literally in the trenches trying to reach the very same people, and they have to ask themselves, and we should be asking them as people who are following their races, how good a job are they doing at not just introducing themselves and putting themselves out there and shining a light on themselves and their platforms and policy positions, but how good a job are they doing by being good civic members, by also reminding and shining a light, reminding voters and shining a light on the new system that's to come, because it's going to also impact their role. So I want to, like, there's already so much work being done around this. The question is, how much is being appended to RCV? And frankly, a lot of it is out of self gain, right? A lot of it is by telling people more about our RCV as a candidate, you stand only to gain. So how much of that is being done as well? Because that's a sort of a natural process already in place.
And council member, I actually want to go to you, because you are not only a sitting lawmaker, you are yourself a candidate who will be running in a ranked choice election. So for you as a candidate, as one of the people, as Deborah Lee has said, is the onus is on you in more than one way.
Yep.
What does it mean for you? What does it look like for you to be educating both as a lawmaker and as a candidate?
So I think it's a dual responsibility, and I certainly don't take that lightly as someone who has supported measures like the education and outreach bill that Councilmember Alika Ampry-Samuel championed a few weeks ago that we passed, but also having a lot of friends that are workers at the Bronx Board of Elections. And I'm so glad you raised that, Rebecca, because a lot of times our BOE workers are certainly underappreciated and not given the fair attention that they need. The resources. Remember, a lot of our boards of elections were open during the entire pandemic. And so a lot of them were very concerned about working in confined spaces, whether they're working on the machines and on the technical side, the AVID department, the registration department. I mean, multiple units that continued to operate while we were all in a pandemic. And so number one, we have to make sure that with any campaign, with any education and outreach, that must extend to the workforce. They're working very long hours, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. And you have to be there at 5 a.m., making sure the site is operable, there's social distancing, the signage is there, there's no one electioneering, the poll workers, the certificates, the coordinators, the AD monitors. I mean, I know this language because I've been working with the board for many years. And so as a candidate, I have a double responsibility to make sure that my campaign speaks about ranked choice voting through literature, through a lot of our door-to-door and digital campaigning, and what that looks like in a COVID world, because it won't be the same as the normal electioning that we are used to, but it's going to be a little bit different this year. But I think every candidate will have to make sure that they make the case and talk about ranked choice voting. What you're seeing a lot, Deborah Lee probably knows, you have a lot of candidates that are running in similar, areas and in the same race that are doubling up and joining forces together. I'm your number one and you're my number two, and all sorts of things, because they know ranked choice voting can be to their advantage. I think what's going to happen, and it's any election, we're all voters, so we know. I mean, the concern is when we get ready for June 22nd, we're going to be inundated with mailings and phone calls and robocalls, and it's going to annoy people. It's going to be too much. It's overload, right? And I know, because I'm a recipient of that. One candidate running in a previous race in the Bronx, I got 12 mails, like oh my goodness, my mailbox. And so I'm just a little worried about that, because I think in the midst of all of that, between mayor, comptroller, borough president, city council races, that people are going to get a little confused, and that, we understand that. So I think the reason why I talked about doing the campaigning and the outreach where people are is that sometimes you get a space where you can talk to them in a level, what, number one, that they understand, that's comfortable, that's convenient. So things like that are things that I'm looking at as a candidate. And I think for me, I have to reinforce my outreach, because I'm not only a legislator, but I'm a candidate as well.
I want to try to squeeze in a couple more questions. We only have a little bit of time left. First off, I've seen, I think, a couple questions about when results for the CD24 will come in. And I think that would be a good opportunity to talk about what voters should expect in terms of what to expect with the elections. The CD24 election, obviously someone had 50%, over 50% in the first round. Still hasn't been declared yet. He hasn't declared victory. There's still a process that we have to wait for, but pretty much it's decided. When we really see this process play out for the first time, what should voters expect? How long will they have to wait for the results?
So RCV elections don't make the reporting process any longer. The RCV tally is done by a computer. So it's literally hitting the button on a keyboard and it happens. However, we know that in New York on election night, you only see first choice votes. And it's the first choice votes of early voters and people who voted on election day. Then you have to wait 7 days before you can start counting absentee ballots and affidavits. And then you have to wait 13 days before you can start counting military overseas ballots. So generally it takes about 2 weeks for the full results to come out. Now keep in mind, if no candidate receives over 50% plus one of first choice votes, then the round by rounds begin. And so again, that process is literally the stroke of a keyboard. So it doesn't take very long, but keep in mind, there are a lot of elections happening in New York City all at once. So in June, it might take a little longer to get the results for all, 50 jurisdictions or something like that, 50 local elections that are taking place. But for the specials, it's about a 2-week process.
And, I wanted to try to squeeze in, before we wrap up, there have been a couple questions as well about making sure that there's enough outreach specifically in public housing for NYCHA residents. What should that look like? What should that look like? In what way should it be any different than any of the other kind of outreach that may be happening at this point in time, specifically to the residents in public housing?
So I know the CFB is specifically tasked with doing outreach to NYCHA properties. And NYCHA is required under the city council bill to do education to its residents. But we as Rank the Vote NYC also are partnering with organizations that are on the ground and actually have hired a team of organizers that are on the ground in every borough to do education. And so, if you were in CD24, you probably got the Northeast Queens NAACP dropping some literature on your doorstep so that, every NYCHA resident in that district was informed. We're going to be doing similar projects with different organizations, in the Bronx. You have, I think it's actually the NYCHA NAACP that is doing education. They've already held one workshop. They're going to be holding another and handing out materials in different languages. So, we're on the ground, not just virtual, because we understand that not everyone has internet access. And we want to make sure every voter has access and information on RCV.
And, the last thing I want to bring up, we are getting right up to the end, Deborah Lee, I believe that this is something that you brought up, and I was hoping that you could just touch on it very briefly. One of the advantages of ranked choice voting that proponents have said is that it helps candidates of color win elections. Obviously, we didn't see that in CD24. We had a white candidate win when we had, I believe, 5 South Asian candidates running.
Right.
You know, what do you take away from this election, and what is there to learn from it? Should we take too much away from it, or do you think that this is something that we need to be conscious of because this was very, very much our first test of it?
Right. Well, I think also CD24 is a unique space in the city. You know, too often New York City is sort of looked at as just this, blank canvas upon which liberals just, finger paint all day long. When in fact, if you look at the city, you'll see that the districts break in very different ways. When you look specifically at this council districts that are up for grabs in the Bronx, the 11th and 15th, one of the things that may escape you when you look at them is that they're actually not just like the county itself, majority minority essentially, but that in fact the spaces in which the candidates will have to work will require them reaching out to everyone in a way that may be unique, particularly when you're talking about the Northwest Bronx district, where Andy Cohen now has moved on to become a judge, where the sort of the seat of power has traditionally been thought to be is in Riverdale, when in fact the district itself is majority minority. And so when you look at these questions, you have to imagine that people will have to work in very traditional ways because they will have sort of their bases to go to, but you have to look very firmly to and very clearly at what the independent expenditures, as I mentioned earlier, may or may not do in these races. Both races have a very diverse field, but frankly, it's the Bronx, and we've always had that kind of diversity to begin with. The question becomes what happens when you are relying a little bit more, again, in these really straightened spaces in which to work on a very short amount of time, and perhaps people might more readily rely on that name recognition. And again, the influence that having an influx of money will do to any race, but your head snapping and turning in 2 to 3 weeks time as you narrow down to election day and an early voting, you might be looking at an outsized impact.
Well, that is, we have reached our end time. Don't want to keep anyone past the time that they need to be here. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today to talk about ranked choice voting. And I would like to invite anyone who's tuned in, if they have any questions, please feel free to email myself if any of the panelists would like to, offer future services as well. I can speak for myself to say that I'm always happy to answer any ranked choice questions that people may have. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope that this was a good, informative session for everyone who tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Path to ranked choice voting. We'll get there.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank goodness so you all know so much about this for the benefit of all of us that are still getting up to speed. And this concludes our second installment of our Ranked Choice Voting Forums. Let's keep the conversation going. Please join us for our annual Diversity Summit on Thursday, February 18th at 1 p.m. Registration is free and can be found in the chat. The second installment of our first read coronavirus update, Effect on Industry, will be on Tuesday, February 23rd at 2 p.m. And the third installment of our Ranked Choice Voting Forum, this one focused on Manhattan, with additional mayoral candidate interviews, will be on Thursday, February 25th at 2 p.m. Registration again is free and can be found in the chat. And thanks again to our great sponsor Spectrum for helping us put on these forums on ranked choice voting. Such an important topic. And thank you to our great events team here at City and State, and to all of you who joined us today. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter at City and State. Catch you next time.